Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about aircraft designs that, in some sense, just don't look quite right. By this, I don't mean designs that are unorthodox or boundary breaking, but rather something that, considering its role, who it served with, and where it served, something about it just looks kind of off or weird. A great example, or examples plural, of this are Japanese fighters in World War II that would use inline liquid-cooled engines. Because of overall lesser manufacturing capabilities, and the fact that radial engines are generally more reliable and serviceable, most of Japan's fighters utilized radial engines, and this was very well known to the Allied forces, to the point where Japan did introduce some inline liquid-cooled engines, and they were mistaken for German, or perhaps Italian fighters, that Japan just imported over. So in general, Japanese fighters that used inline engines just didn't look quite right, so much so that other countries didn't believe they were Japanese origin. Sticking with inline engines, you can also say that American carrier-based fighters with inline engines didn't look quite right either, as the US Navy very much preferred using radials over inline engines. This wasn't due to manufacturing restrictions, though. America very much had the capacity and the ability to produce powerful and reliable inline engines. But when you combine the fact that radials are reliable overall, pretty compact, and are generally lighter due to not needing an additional cooling system, and are easier to service, the Navy preferred them over inline engines, which would make an American carrier-based aircraft with an inline engine look kind of weird. For one final example, and an example relating directly to our subject for today, we're sticking again with inline engines, and you can say that multi-engine bombers that use inline engines just don't look quite right. Think of the most iconic bombers from World War II, the B-24, the B-29, the Ju-88, and many, many more. The vast majority of them either use or appear to use radial engines, and thinking about it, it isn't hard to figure out why. Along with the reliability and serviceability, them not needing a liquid cooling system reduced the weight, which would help the bomber hold more bombs. And with a larger, slower bomber, you also don't have to worry all that much about the worse aerodynamic performance of radial engines. Because of these factors and more, seeing a World War II-era bomber, especially a larger four-engine bomber, with inline engines just looks kind of weird. It did still occur, though, occasionally. The Ju-88, for example, actually did use inline engines, just with an annular radiator that allowed it to run as a de facto radial. But some multi-engine bombers did use inline engines as inline engines, liquid cooling system and all, and one of them just so happens to be one of, if not the best British bomber in the entirety of World War II, dropping over 500,000 tons of explosives over its 3.5-year World War II career. This is the Avro Lancaster. To start its story, we have to go back to mid-1936, with the Royal Air Ministry looking to upgrade its current stable of twin-engine medium bombers, and through specification P1336, they sought a pretty ambitious aircraft. They wanted a twin-engine bomber that could carry a payload upward of 8,000 pounds, with a range of 2,000 miles, or a payload of 4,000 pounds with a range of 3,000 miles. It was also to be capable of fitting two 18-inch torpedoes, and to be capable of performing in a dive bomber role. It needed a cruise speed of 275 miles an hour, a defensive armament of at least 6 303 machine guns, and a crew of just 4. because of the state of British engine technology and just engine technology in general at the time. This left any prospective company trying to fulfill these specs with a very limited pool from which to work from. In 1936, there were basically three realistic or semi-realistic options here. There was the Bristol Hercules, the Napier Sabre, and the Rolls Royce Vulture. 2 years later, the Bristol Centaurus became an option as well, but for 1936 it was the former three, and all of them weren't terribly enticing options really. The Hercules was probably the most reliable of them, but in 1936 its power output was just barely above 1,000 horsepower, far too low for what they needed. The Sabre was very early in its development and would not be ready for several more years, but it did promise power of 2,000 horsepower or more in 1935-36. Lastly, the Vulture probably offered the best combination of reliability and power, being effectively two Rolls-Royce Peregrines combined to run as a single unit, with a projected power output of around 1,700 horsepower. While the Peregrine wasn't a proven engine as of yet, it was next in line to Rolls-Royce's own Kestrel model, a solid and decently powerful engine for its time. This at the very least gave the Peregrine and the Vulture the air of reliability. So as the Sabre didn't end up really being ready until 1940 or 41, and the Hercules wasn't powerful enough, and the Centaurus didn't start work until 1938 or so, this left the Vulture as the only realistic option. And when four companies, Avro, Hawker, Bristol, and Handley Page, submitted their designs, at least two of them used the Vulture in them, and those two designs were selected for further designing and prototype production. The first design selected was Avro's 679, and the second was Handley Page's HP56, and two prototypes of each were ordered in 1937. Development of both of these bombers was relatively slow, although there wasn't a major hurry at the time, to be fair. But very early in their respective developments, a major warning sign specifically for the Avro 679 would flash when Handley Page was requested to redesign the HP56 with four Rolls Royce Merlin engines in the place of the two Vultures. The Vulture, at this point, was already experiencing reliability issues, and issues outputting its promised power. So presumably, as the HP56 was technically the backup option to the Avro design, it would be given the backup engine setup as well in case the Vulture didn't work out. The 679, though, would stick with the Vulture, and by July 25, 1939, the first 679 prototype, now with the name of Manchester, it was ready to take to the air. With a sort of thin rectangular fuselage, a lengthy greenhouse canopy, a twin-fin tail, and no armament as of yet, the first Manchester was unstable, which then led to the installation of a third tail fin on the fuselage. With this alteration, and shortly thereafter with the addition of the defensive armament, the effective true first Manchester was in the air, and while the design was now relatively stable and was overall pleasurable to fly, the desired performance from the 1936 specs were not being reached. Remember, they wanted a cruise speed of 275 miles an hour. At best, with a reduced payload, the Manchester could only hit a top speed of 264, and with its maximum payload that pushed its weight to over 50,000 pounds, the cruising speed would drop to just 205 miles an hour. This disappointing speed performance was at least partially due to the weight ballooning up past 50,000 pounds max. With that weight and the aircraft's sheer size, it is going to be a bit sluggish inherently. But much worse was the problem that the Vulture engines were both wholly unreliable and did not output 1700 plus horsepower. But it was still early in the career of the Vulture, I guess, and there was probably the assumption that the issues with it could be worked out, and in 1940, production model Manchesters with the Vulture would be delivered, and they began seeing service shortly thereafter. That service, though, was fraught with issues, with the Manchester constantly being grounded because of innumerable engine failures of all sorts. For the Vulture, whenever one problem was solved, it seemed like another popped up in its place. A real game of whack-a-mole. Additionally, some additional smaller faults were found in the Manchester's frame design, which then required further grounding and alteration. And inevitably, by late 1941, Avro and the Air Ministry had had enough with the Manchester, and production of it was halted, ending at just 202 aircraft. Ultimately, the Vulture engine was never able to overcome its many issues. But luckily for Rolls-Royce, Avro, and the British military, another Rolls-Royce project was going much more smoothly, and was outputting solid power, it had good reliability, and it used half the cylinders of the Vulture, and that was the Rolls Royce Merlin. In late 1940, with the Vulture going through its plethora of problems, Avro decided to follow in Handley Page's footsteps, and proposed that a new model Manchester in the Manchester 3 be made. Now, the Manchester 2, if you're wondering, was supposed to have the Centaurus engine. The Manchester 3, on the other hand, would see its wingspan slightly increased, and it would see the installation of 4 Merlin engines. Generally speaking, rather little would be different between the early Manchester 1 and the Manchester 3. While in development, the Manchester 1 did lose its third tail fin, and received larger twin fins, the Manchester 3 had that third fin re-added for some reason. Other than that, and the increased wingspan because of the 2 additional engines, the Manchester 3 by and large retained the original design of the Manchester 1. Measuring in at 21.18 meters long, 31.09 meters wide, and 6.1 meters tall, the Manchester 3's wingspan increased by about 10 feet, to make proper room for those additional engines. Those 4 engines, all Merlins, were installed in so-called power eggs, a type of installation that denotes an engine setup that contains all of its necessary elements in a singular contained unit. So for its inline liquid-cooled Merlin engines, both the engine and the cooling system were all contained within that nacelle. This would make it very easy to perform maintenance on the plane's engines. If one of them were to fail, or be damaged, or just become old, just pop out that nacelle and slide in a fresh one, good as new. For the rest of the design, again, it was basically the same as the Manchester 1. Because so little was different on the Manchester 3, it didn't take very long to construct it, and by January 9th, 1941, it, at this point given a separate designation as the Lancaster 1, it would take to the air for the first time. Despite the fact that the 2 additional engines ended up increasing the weight by a decent amount, them being more reliable, and them having a combined power over 4,400 horsepower, made it very clear to the RAF, the Air Ministry, and Avro that the 4-engine setup was the correct move. Already in this very early state, it was hitting speeds of 242 miles an hour at 4,600 feet, and its handling was considered very solid. Later that year, in May, the second prototype Lancaster would take to the air in its new, more definitive and well-known form. The 3-fin tail was replaced with the wider twin-fin tail. Why they went back to the 3-fin tail in the first place, I'm not terribly sure, but this helped to improve the aircraft's stability. And with that central fin gone, the tail turret would have more room to traverse. The second prototype would also have stronger engines installed, with nearly 1,300 horsepower apiece. Not only would this help boost the top speed, but it also helped increase the max takeoff weight to over 60,000 pounds. Offensively speaking, the Lancaster initially shared in the Manchester's bomb outfit, carrying bombs as large as 4,000 pounds and a total bomb load as large as 12 to 14,000 pounds. To make it more offensively versatile, though, the bomb bay was gradually made larger, more bulbous, to carry larger 8,000 and 12,000 pound bombs. Later on still in the war, a few select dozen Lancasters were modified to fit the massive Grand Slam 22,000 pound bomb. The Lancasters that flew this bomb were incredibly crippled as a result, though, with the aircraft not being able to do much more than fly straight and level. Regardless, though, this allowed Britain to use the largest conventional bomb seen in World War II. Defensively speaking, the Lancaster was relatively well defended, with its 10 total .303 caliber guns consolidated into 4 turrets. In the nose, in front of the pilot, and just above the bombardier, sat a pair of guns in a singular turret. This gun would be operated by the bombardier, who could pretty easily move between both stations there. In the dorsal and ventral positions were a pair of twin turrets, and in the tail was a larger 4-gun turret with around 10,000 rounds at the gunner's disposal. This baseline defensive armament wouldn't end up being the most common setup, though, as the vast majority of Lancasters made elected to remove the ventral turret specifically, due to it being more difficult to aim and operate effectively. So, with the Lancaster's overall better, or at the very least more consistent and reliable performance, production focus shifted completely away from the Manchester and over to the Lancaster, and due to them being incredibly similar, it didn't take long for the first production models to roll off the line in mid to late 1941. The Manchester lines could be pretty easily switched over, so the transition could be just about seamless. In fact, it was so seamless that some of the last Manchesters that were being made were pretty easily converted over to Lancasters. As these early Lancasters rolled off the line, even though Rolls-Royce, now free of the problematic Vulture engine, they could focus more on the more reliable and popular Merlin engine, the fact that the Lancaster used 4 of them, and the fact that the Merlin was a very popular engine, meant that there was a realistic possibility that there would be too few of them to go around, which threatened not only the Lancaster, but a lot of British aviation in general. So, as a just-in-case preventative measure, a month after the first flight of the production model Lancaster in October 1941, the Lancaster II would take to the air on November 26th. This new model only really differed in the fact that it had a more traditional and normal-looking, at least to me, outfit of 4 radial Bristol Hercules engines. These alternate radial-powered Lancasters performed fine, but with Avro and the Air Ministry now having a very direct comparison between the radial and the inline-powered Lancasters, it became clear to them that the inline engines were the far better option. Now, it's not as if the Mark II model Lancasters were bad, but they did have worse performance at high altitudes, a lower top speed, and a slightly reduced payload. But on the other hand, they were a backup, sort of just-in-case aircraft, so it was fine, really. Avro wouldn't even be tasked with their production. Instead, that was delegated over to Armstrong Whitworth, and ultimately they only made about 300 of them. This was because the Merlin shortage never really materialized, and America began producing Merlins under license as the Packard V1650. And with those engines in production, Avro would be able to produce the Lancaster III. The only difference between it and the Lancaster I being that the three had the American-made Merlins. It was of the Mark I and Mark III that the vast majority of Lancasters were produced and used in the Second World War, and aside from later production models of both of those aircraft having slightly stronger Merlin engines installed, relatively little changed about the design over the course of the war, and quite frankly, not much needed to be improved upon here. Its production model top speed of 287 miles an hour was near or at the top of the British heavy bomber pecking order. It performed very well at high altitudes, it had the highest maximum payload, and its maneuverability, handling, and flying characteristics were excellent. The Handley Page Halifax and Short Stirling bombers, to be fair, weren't that much worse than the Lancaster, but the Lancaster was just overall considered to be the better aircraft, and as a result, it would see the most use of all British heavy bombers in the war, and it was the most produced heavy bomber in the war for the British, with nearly 7,000 of them being made in the war alone. Now, getting into its combat performance, as the Lancaster was the most used British heavy bomber, it should come as no surprise that it was very effective at its main job as a night bomber. The bulk of British bombing was conducted at night, using the cover of darkness as some additional defense, and it's under the cover of night that the Lancaster dropped the vast majority of its more than 500,000 tons of explosives. Due to its prevalence in combat, it would take a very long time to talk about all of its combat experience, so instead I want to briefly talk about two events or situations. One really neat, interesting usage of the Lancaster, and one problem that the Lancaster experienced. Starting with the problem, recall that early in the Lancaster's development, its defensive weaponry was reduced by one turret, with the ventral turret being removed. This lack of an underside defensive gun did leave the Lancaster a little bit more vulnerable to its underside, and German night fighters caught on to this, and implemented the Schrage music attack system, guns that would fire upwards from the fuselage behind the cockpit. This started to become a little bit of an issue for the Lancaster, with it being unable to properly defend itself against these attacks, and a small number of Lancasters were then fit with downward-firing machine guns or cannons, a sort of opposite counter-Schrage music. Ultimately, these guns didn't have much of an effect for the Lancaster, and they weren't really used. But still, this small little saga is nevertheless an interesting little chain of events, of a seemingly pointless and difficult weapon being removed on the Lancaster, only for its removal to then be exploited by the enemy. For the more neat and interesting usage of the Lancaster, we have its use of the Upkeep bouncing bomb in Operation Chastise. The Upkeep bomb, technically a type of depth charge, was a large cylindrical drum that weighed 9,250 pounds, and it was intended to counter anti-torpedo measures, like nets and whatnot. The idea was that this very large drum, attached to the underside of a bomber with a motor of some kind, the drum would be spun up with a backspin, and at a certain distance away from the target, it would be released over the water. This would then start an internal fuse as it dropped, and because of its backspin, when it finally hit the water, instead of just sinking right down, it bounced off the water and into the air again, and would do so several times before finally sinking. It's like the bomber was skipping a really big stone. This way, it would avoid the anti-torpedo measures and would land in the water just before its target, where it would start to sink a little bit, and then its fuse would finally go off and it would explode. In Operation Chastise in May 1943, a number of Avro Lancasters, due to their size and carrying capacity, were selected to use these Upkeep bombs. specifically targeting German hydroelectric dams in the west of Germany, near the Ruhr Valley. These dams not only supplied electricity to nearby industrial and civilian areas, but they also provided water for drinking and just general use. These dams were relatively important to the region, and thus were relatively important to Germany's war machine, so they became targets of the British. These attacks were actually pretty successful. For the loss of 8 British aircraft, 2 of the dams were breached and a third was damaged, which then forced Germany to devote thousands of laborers to rapidly repair the dams. Strangely though, Britain never followed up on these attacks to keep the dams out of action, and by September 1943, the dams were then back online, and that was kind of the end of Operation Chastise. Regardless of Britain's failure to keep pressing Germany after that operation, it was a very interesting and unique attack, and Britain's most used heavy bomber had a hand in it. From its start as a twin-engine bomber that was using a new, highly problematic engine, the relatively simple fix of fitting 4 of the Merlin engine turned it from a problematic dud to a war winner, perfect for the night bombing of Germany, even though, at least to me, it looked pretty odd with its 4 inline engines. That oddity proved to not only be solid, but actually better than the alternative. I guess it goes to show that at least sometimes, being unique and odd can be a very good thing. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You know, with the Upkeep bomb, I really like the comedic value of it. Like, I just imagine a German soldiers on the ground and they're watching Britain drop it, and they just start laughing because they think they massively undershot their target. But then this 10,000-pound drum just starts bouncing along the water, and the smile on the soldier's face starts to fade and turns to horror. I mean, that's comedy gold right there. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.